My name is Stella Tkatchova, and in my free time I write books about commercial space markets and technologies. In this webinar, I would like to share my views with you about future lunar space markets, following upon my last book, Emerging Space Markets. So during this webinar, we will discuss further in detail emerging space markets, Lunar Orbital Station Gateway and the Moon Village, ISS future markets, natural lunar resources, and future lunar space markets and innovative concepts. So, on slide 3, we will ask ourselves, what are the emerging space markets? How do we classify them? What are the definitions we can use? As emerging space markets are multidisciplinary, user-driven markets driven by the demand of space-based resources. The next question I will address is, what is the lunar economy? So it's too early probably to talk about it, but already there are many organizations talking about the lunar economy. As you can see, we will start with ISS commercialization, with commercial LEO exploration, and then we will continue with the lunar space, return to the moon in the long term, and using the moon as a step ahead for future Mars exploration. Well, we shouldn't forget, of course, that when we talk about lunar exploration, we should not forget the major objectives, which they are. The objectives are crew flights around the moon by 2024, human presence at the moon, and sustained local resources by 2040, successful commercialization of the International Space Station, opportunity for private space companies actually to develop new products and services. So the idea is to have long-term and continuous robotic missions to the moon by the middle of 2020, and actually to have commercial space companies as equal partners into this new way of exploring the moon. So how did NASA launch this concept? Well, recently NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, the Chinese Space Agency, the Indian Research Institute, and all the world space agencies actually developed the Global Exploration Roadmap under the International Space Exploration Coordination Group. This group proposed to have innovative and sustainable program for exploration with commercial and international partners, which will enable the expansion across the solar system and bring new knowledge back to Earth. So the idea was to return, and the idea is still to return to the moon, astronauts, and use the lunar resources for not only for exploration but also for utilization, and then later on to have future Mars missions. So on slide 7 we can see what are the principles behind this new way of exploring the moon, in contrast to 50 years ago when the Apollo 11 landed and when NASA had initiated the Apollo missions. Well, now we talk about affordability. So we would like to have innovative approaches that enable more achievable with the current budgets, and costs will be consideration. So that is extremely important. The second part is that exploration benefits have to be very clearly defined for sustainable human space exploration. Partnerships, so as earlier I mentioned, public-private partnerships might potentially become the way to continue with exploration, and not only continue with exploration, but to create new markets and services. And then it's very important to have the capability and for further development and interoperability, and creating also a human robotic partnership to emphasize and maximize on the synergies between human and robotic missions. All these new principles are also linked to robustness, where it's very important to have resilience to the technical and programmatic challenges which all the space agencies involved in this vision will face. So in this exploration and in this roadmap, global roadmap, an important role also plays the European Moon Village, ESA Moon Village. This Moon Village is actually an idea which has been circling since a few 2 or 3 years, and a lot of European companies are starting actively to work on it. So, inspired by the interest in lunar exploration, ESA launched a ESA Space Resources Strategy 2020. So this strategy actually sets up the space resources need and addresses some of the fundamental questions, or mainly puts the questions on the table. How can the resources of space be used to support sustainable space exploration? What knowledge do we need to gain? What technologies do we need to develop? What role should we play? What are the benefits and risks for space and for Earth? So these are the questions which come upon. And here the European Space Strategy focuses on confirming whether space resources can enable space sustainable exploration. And for the first time in the European Space Agency history, talking directly at such a strategic level about identifying and creating new economic opportunities for European space industries, thus creating benefits and new innovations which will result in this sustainable exploration. Of course, the agency also is looking for attracting new industrial actors and establishing ESA as part of a broader community supporting the building and the creation of a future moon village. So, but we shouldn't forget that in addition to ESA, there is mainly, NASA had already initiated the lunar program. So we have the NASA Lunar Catalyst program, the NASA Next Step program, NASA Commercial Lunar Payload Delivery Service program, and also not only ESA's programs, but in Europe we also have the Horizon 2020 Space Goal, the Future Emerging Technologies Goals, and these are all, institutional programs which encourage future commercial exploration. But NASA also wants to set up a cost-sharing model to track investments to the Lunar Cargo Transportation Services program, while ESA is looking at attracting commercial partners to set up partnerships for future Moon Village, or the so-called concept ESA multi-partner concept. So all these programs, hopefully, will result and encourage much more and enable much more faster commercial lunar exploration. So what is the lunar exploration vision? As we can see, we start first with the space station commercialization, then later on we will have the gateway station around lunar orbit, and then we will have also the moon village. But when we talk about ISS commercialization, we should definitely not forget the importance of the success of ISS commercialization, because presently the successful ISS markets will liberate funds for NASA and the ISS partners to focus and invest these funds on actual lunar exploration. So presently, by 2018, we have, at least on the US side, 135 commercial payloads which have been flown. It is expected demand for microgravity experiments by 2029 to grow up to 300 experiments per year. Commercialization of the space station is not a new idea. It's been circling since 2001. In the last years, however, there have been strong investors' interests, and there have been more and more experiments. So actually, new drug development on board the space station for treating osteoporosis and success stories like Prolia, drug for treating it, can be very useful, or others like new cancer preventive treatment development. So it has been proven that research on new drug development, microencapsulation, hip spine diagnostics equipment, cell and tissue engineering are areas of big potential growth. In addition, we shouldn't forget that research and experiments on board the space station, like 3D printing of companies like Made in Space, are experiments which you can also perform on the board the future Gateway space station. So the questions which we raise and come up are the following. So as you can see, the lunar resources are the following: water, methane, regosylate metals, and platinum group metals. So recent studies of the natural lunar resources have shown that there is potentially a lot of resources, like we can extract the water and break it into hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel. The fuel then can be stored in refueling stations and be used for refueling geotelecommunication satellites. In addition, the availability of fuel on the lunar or around lunar orbit will enable the growth of space mining operation, lunar scouting, lunar prospecting, and so on. So there is a lot of potential in the resources which are coming up. Of course, in Europe, when we're looking at the European vision, we shouldn't forget there is a mission-oriented already scenario where we look at the innovation and industrial strategy for space resources. So as you can see clearly on slide 15, there is the challenge to have a sustained and sustainable human presence in space by 2014. This is the vision in a way, and it's going to be a transversal activity where we'll have artificial intelligence and robotics, construction engineering, mining, law, ethics, having a number of projects which will be linked to the various resources like water, oxygen, propellant, low waste manufacturing, and not only resources but capabilities and activities. But of course, an important aspect which we shouldn't forget is how did it all start and how did this new vision get initiated? Well, actually, it all started with expected value, the future of the future space resources utilization industry. The value is expected of a market revenue of 73 to 170 billion euros by 2018 and 2045. Of course, this is a study which is supported by the Luxembourg Space Agency, the first European country which actually started to invest funding and implement an official governmental program to encourage lunar space exploration or space resources utilization. So this is quite new as a whole in the European space industry. This capability which the Luxembourg Space Agency and Luxembourg is pushing in Europe is actually leading to a lot of American companies opening offices in Luxembourg and starting their own business and cooperating with the Luxembourg Space Agency for new projects related exactly to space resource utilization. But let's see, what are the possible lunar exploration applications? So, extraction of water and iron, nickel, titanium, having rare and costly materials on Earth and using them and sending them back to Earth to be used in electronics, and mainly having hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel, and also metals for manufacturing, also performing lunar mining or 3D printing on the lunar surface. As you can see later on, there are certain companies which are actually performing and studying the side lunar economy in the context of the cost of propellant from Earth to the Moon. Companies like the United Launch Alliance look at the gross space product at almost 1 trillion per year by 2030. Not only that, but some companies have already expressed interest in using lunar-based propellant. So as you can see, the price of the cost of propellant from Earth is much higher than the one produced on the Moon. So here we can say that we have quite of a interesting business case, an attractive business case, especially in the case where we can have propellant depots for fueling satellites and future missions to Earth. So let's see what happens in Europe on the European innovative concept. So at the moment we have Alchemist aiming at performing lunar mining, but like a demonstration payload by 2025. And then we have Hercules mission, which is planned by 2026. And the idea is that the Hercules coincides with the upcoming Orion missions to carry crew to the Lunar Gateway. So the idea is that the Hercules collects some lunar samples and then actually gets launched to the Lunar Gateway. And from there, the astronauts bring back the samples. Other interesting European innovations led by the European Space Agency are the concept of 3D printing techniques using lunar soil. And here you can see a photo on slide 21 of the lunar soil for a 1.5 ton building block. So the idea is to demonstrate 3D printing techniques using lunar soil. When we are building the Moon Village, of course, we have to think about also inflatable modules and 3D printing processes, which will be used to produce multiple parts from lunar soils for shelters against radiation and micrometeorites. Of course, lunar exploration cannot be achievable if we don't talk about the rovers, the lunar rovers. So here on the photo you can see the Love Me rover. Also you can see the iSpace, Japanese one, iSpace, which was part of the Google X Prize with a Hakuro Air commercial payload. And then you can see the Moon Express and recently the Chang'e 4, which recently landed on the dark side of the moon. Actually, the interesting part about the Chinese Chang'e 4 was that they also launched a telecom satellite, Tkatchova, in hollow orbit, which was permitting to perform telecommunication with the Earth. So it is very possible that in the future, Chinese launch more and more follow-up missions like the Chang'e 5 and other missions for future lunar explorations. However, continuing with the focus on the European lunar rovers, I would like to tell you more about the LoveMe rover, which is a small light rover which will be looking and specifically for water and potential water and volatiles on the lunar surface. It might be also carrying some external commercial payloads on board. Other interesting projects are ones, as you can see on page 24, on slide 24 of the European Cubesat. So the company called Stella Industries is actually working at small moon rover missions using different CubeSats targeted at moon-based customers, but also Earth-based customers. And as you can see, there are a lot of interesting developments taking place in Europe for lunar exploration. However, no matter of all these optimistic scenarios and the expected value of space resource utilization of 170 billion from 2018 to 2045, we shouldn't forget that the most important aspect is safe human exploration infrastructure. And therefore, stations like the Gateway, which is being proposed by NASA, in orbit of 1,500 kilometers around the moon, will need to be further investigated, as we don't also know how we will continue exploration. It's also important to have initial robotic exploration to find the deposits, whether the deposits on the moon are sufficient for sustainable resource exploration. Of course, all these activities and infrastructure construction will come with high costs of technologies and competence development. And the most difficult part for commercial companies would be identifying the exact markets and potential customers. Plus, sometimes there will be the difficulties of undefined direct and indirect benefits, or the existence of vague information on the expected return of investment from in situ resource utilization. Furthermore, Europe will have to increase its independence and be able to perform exploration, lunar exploration, with less dependencies on non-EU technologies, thus learning from the lessons learned from the ISS station exploration. So, when we talk about lunar exploration, of course, we shouldn't forget that the creation of the Moon Village will attract private companies to perform R&D research. There will be use of lunar sand for the construction of lunar modules. There will be potentially the opportunity for 3D printing on board the Lunar Space Station, the Gateway, which will actually contribute to printing missing tools or parts needed not only on board the station, but on a future Moon Village. So as we can see, there is a lot of interesting activities which will be taking place. So it is very important that the EU and the European Space Agency consider even setting up a program for research networks to support competencies and technologies evolution to up to Tier 06, and even set up programs similar to NASA Lunar Catalyst program. Learn from NASA in that respect, and think always about what are the new markets that will emerge and grow, Will private companies succeed to build sustainable business models to support their activities? So, in conclusion, national space agencies will have to clearly define the direct and indirect benefits from lunar exploration in order to win political support, a strategic one too. European private companies will need to attract venture capital and to develop new markets and generate return of investment. Competitive innovation will be a prerequisite for success. And as you see on slide 29, in situ lunar exploitation, space debris mitigation, in-orbit satellite servicing are some of the markets worth exploring. Competitive driving forces, reduced time in qualifying and flying payloads in short lead times will create opportunities and challenges. But new space companies will need to discover, identify, and develop these emerging space markets and attract the customers, of course. And one thing which we should never forget from our dark clock is the dinosaurs became extinct because they didn't have a space program. And if we become extinct because we don't have a space program, it will serve us right. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening to this webinar. Do feel free to share with me your questions or recommendations.